We'll start our recording. All right, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Wisconsin Trout Unlimited's Talking Trout. We've had an extended summer vacation, and that has pretty much led through the fall, and now we've woken up to some frozen temperatures here in Wisconsin, and it's certainly time to get back together for everybody on and start doing these virtual meetings again. So we've got some really interesting speakers lined up for the next couple of months, and we're glad you can join us tonight, and hope you'll check in the future. Again, we're going to run these the first Wednesday of the month, at 8 o'clock. And then if you're not able to make it for some reason, we always try to post them on our YouTube channel. So feel free to go back, and you just search Wisconsin Trout Unlimited on YouTube, and you'll find us pretty quick. And most of the past episodes will be up on there. So I will start out tonight. I'm pretty excited. A good friend of mine, Professor Jason Freund, is currently working at the University of Wisconsin La Crosse, is going to be on tonight. He's in the process of working with some of his students, doing some pretty cool research. And if you haven't checked out his blog, I would highly recommend it. It's the Scientific Fly Angler, something Jason started during COVID just to kind of just for something to do, I think, to get some thoughts out there and put some pen to paper, so to speak, although it's all keyboard now. But the really interesting posts that he's putting up there, and it's not all geared towards fly angling. Most of it is really just like river science and stream ecology and things like that a lot of the average trout enthusiast, I think, would really benefit from reading some of his stuff. So I would encourage you to check that out. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Jason, and let you maybe fill us in on the rest of your background and what you're going to talk about tonight.
Sure. So, so I do research here at University of Wisconsin La Crosse. Hopefully, I will have a grad student that maybe we'll do a talking trout here later in the spring when he's got his data a little bit more together. But we're working on that right now, looking at brook trout distributions in the Driftless. And kind of why they are where they are. My talk tonight is more, I'm just going to go to it and share the screen. And but tonight is kind of a Driftless talk, mostly, not entirely. So I think some of these issues are kind of issues we have everywhere. So it's going to talk a little bit about climate change and flooding, particularly those of us that remember the 2018 event, which this is the photo is part of the aftermath of. And then we'll talk a little bit about stream manipulation. I think that's kind of the best word for what it is we do in the Driftless, and kind of what's worked and where things haven't worked a little bit. So that's kind of what the talk is, and that's just kind of me. So I'm a Coulee Region Trout Unlimited Vice President, and I work at UW La Crosse, and I've done quite a bit of stuff at the Wisconsin Trout Unlimited level as well. And then Mike had mentioned the blog. So this is a talk I gave at Valley Stewardship Network about a year ago this time. And I've changed it just a little bit to include a few new things, including like the last blog post I wrote, which was about when trout spawn, and some tiger trout photos that people had given me. So I was writing about once a week, and that's gotten to be a little too much. So about every other week I put something out now, but lots of old stuff on there that's hopefully useful and interesting as well. So anyway, hopefully you find that fun. So our outline tonight, we're going to talk about climate change and show you bunches of evidence, not just for the Driftless, but kind of throughout Wisconsin on climate change, kind of one of the biggest things we're dealing with. Talk a little bit about flooding, particularly around that 2018 flood, which was really kind of the big game changer in our area. A little bit about the Driftless, the history, and kind of where we are today. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about stream manipulation and kind of some of the in-stream stuff we do, and kind of what it's geared to do, and what's worked. So climate change impacts, it's warmer. So we've had milder winters. You've noticed that certainly we haven't had a white Christmas in a while now, although it snowed yesterday. That's pretty well gone away today. We've had warmer summers, and we've had greater temperature anomalies. That is, greater swings in temperature. And It's been wetter, although this year you would not have said that. We have caught up fairly quickly this fall again, though. So it's been a little bit more boom or bust. This is images or figures from Kirk Olson and his crew about trout on the West Fork, and showing this idea of how precipitation has increased, how that's led to an increase in the minimum, so the min and the max base flows in our streams. Essentially, our streams have, again, this summer was not a good example, but our streams have generally had more water in them than they have had historically. And with that also, though, we've had large precipitation events, and that's been some of what's kept base flow. It's also been kind of a detriment in many cases to habitat, and kind of on the climate change thing. So there's lots of different ways we look at this. One of those is certainly this idea where we can plot where La Crosse, Wisconsin is and what it's going to be like in 60 years. And it puts us in a climate a little bit, quite a bit warmer than we currently are. So somewhere in sort of the eastern part of Kansas, western part of Missouri. And looking at data, being a science guy, I always like data. So looking at the annual maximum temperatures. So we're seeing increases in that everywhere, 3 to 4 degrees in some cases Fahrenheit. I think this one's really significant, that the minimum temperature, so how cool it has gotten at night, has warmed even more significantly in most places. Again, I'm going to be talking driftless area. I'm largely going to be talking about kind of this part of the state, but you can certainly see where you are in the state and kind of where that fits in as well. This is looking at the number of days over 90 degrees. This year for La Crosse, we have hit 30 of them, which is kind of more in tune with what we expect in, another 20 years or so, 20 years or more. So 41 to 60 conditions. We've kind of reached that this summer, and we have in a few of the last years. I do find kind of interesting, this little area kind of in the center part of Vernon County tends to get a little bit cooler, which I sort of find interesting. Anyway, we've seen changes in precipitation. Again, you wouldn't see this everywhere necessarily, but we're talking about what we've seen from 1950 to 2018 is about a 20% increase in precipitation for the southwestern counties in the state, a little bit less to the north. Although again, last winter, they certainly made up for that in snowfall up there. And then if we're looking at June, July, and August precipitation, again, you wouldn't tell it from this year, but on average over that time period, we've seen a fairly great increase, about 15 to 20%, depending upon where you are in the southern part of Wisconsin, at least. Notice that in northern Wisconsin, quite a bit drier in the summers instead. Again, this is over quite a long time frame. And then just a bit more on this so talking about the big rainfalls, these are precipitation events over 2 inches and what they're looking like kind of currently and what we're projecting. So we're expecting essentially more larger, and this is per decade. So, 2-inch rainfall is relatively rare, but they're getting to be more common. And what's probably more significant than 2-inch rainfalls are talking about like 5+ inch rainfalls. So these are greater than 5-inch rainfalls, and seeing a number of places in Wisconsin where they're expected to happen quite a bit more commonly. So more days, and again, now we're talking per 100 years, but any 5-inch rainfall in a day is pretty well going to lead to a flood event. Speaking of flood events, this was kind of the big one that we all remember and talk a lot about. So here, Vernon County, this northern part, kind of the watershed divide between Timber Coulee and the West Fork in particular, are 2 of the watersheds that got hit the hardest, talking about 20 inches of rainfall, which is really significant. We had a number of dam failures. I'll talk about a couple of those just a little bit here in a bit. We've always had flooding in the Driftless, right? It's nothing new that we've had. That's why some of the cities like Soldiers Grove had moved in the 1970s, early 80s, kind of that had happened. So certainly there has always been flooding. But if we look at the records, we see 4 of our greatest events have happened in the last 15 years. So, and our largest ever event, 2018. So this 19.4 feet on the gauge at Lafarge happened, fairly recently. And if you look at kind of the highest ones in the past, we've had a couple that have been bigger than that 78 flood, which was always kind of the big one for a lot of people that have lived in the Driftless for a long time. And this was a predicted stream gauge. This one instead hit about 19.52 feet. And if you remember that storm we had in late August in 2018, it was followed by a couple of rainfalls on that saturated ground. So instead of this nice kind of declining, falling limb like we see here, we saw these big spikes too, because we had rainfall on top of already saturated ground. And so the impacts of this are things like, this is Jersey Valley. This is a more recent aerial image of it. Probably one of the reasons that the West Fork has had some temperature issues of late is we no longer have the bottom draw in there, but we still have sort of the dam in place. So we have a much reduced pool, but no cooling water coming out. So we have this big stagnant place that's able to warm it up. And hopefully something will be happening with that site fairly soon. I know the counties are working on it. And when that dam gave way, you may remember the old blue cabin at the West Fork, and this was it right after that flood. So went out and helped try to clean this up. And this hole, of course, has been filled in. We have so those that go to the West Fork know that that Brookie cabin sits right about in that spot right now. It, of course, is on wheels. So when we get those big events, we can pick it up and move it. And of course, this was huge in the news, right? We had 14 dams fall in the last decade, a bunch of them due to flooding in 2018 in particular. We talk about, not just in the Driftless, but in southern Wisconsin, 10 inches there. Talking about floods forcing decisions for people in other parts of Wisconsin. The Mississippi Basin, kind of an interesting year. This year, we had some of the highest water levels ever this spring. And then as the summer, they got pretty darn low. So we kind of went from feast to famine in terms of how much water was in the big river. Flooding in Waukesha, kind of talking about climate change in Pakistan even. So all kinds of places that, we're seeing all this climate change. I'm going to kind of relate it more to the Driftless area. Those of you who may be familiar and read the blog a little bit, I had a little fun with our mud duck friends and our Iowegian friends about how they're not truly driftless. They have a driftless-like topography. So some of the more recent research has kind of been compiled and looked and found that truly those areas have had glaciations. They're just over 500,000 years old. Anyway, those that know the Driftless and the Coulees know we have this highly erosional landscape that's kind of dominated by rivers that have carved those valleys, because that area has been that way for a long, long time, millions of years. To talk about the Driftless, this was one of the posts I've written a while back about Driftless pre-settlement vegetation. Was kind of fun to look at. I think one of the things to just think about is that the Driftless wasn't homogeneous. You hear people a lot of times, well, it was prairie or it was savanna. Well, it was, but we had more than just prairie and savanna. I think in particular, one of the kind of the cool things, if you look at the map, it's pretty distinct. So to the east side of the Kickapoo River, that part of the watershed would have been a much more wet forest, a mesic forest with sugar maples and basswoods and elms and things like that. So that eastern part of the watershed was quite a bit different. Looking at vegetation, so again, we would have had a lot of savanna. Savanna is kind of dominated by grasses with fairly sparse trees. Why I seem to remember this, but 18 trees per acre is kind of the definite, 18 or fewer is sort of the definition of a savanna. So we would have had fairly sparsely treed landscapes, mostly white oaks and bur oaks, depending on where we were in the Driftless, as we'll see here. So again, this part of the Driftless quite a bit different, where we're picking up more sugar maple and basswood, whereas a lot of it, it's mostly white oaks and bur oaks, or kind of, especially bur oak as you get more into Minnesota, a little bit more white oak as we get into Wisconsin, where it had been a little bit wetter always. And this figure, so another sort of out of one of forestry type journals, looking at the different trees that had happened. And again, kind of bur oaks here in the Minnesota part, in the Wisconsin part, more white oaks. And then you can kind of see, if it's not in the way, the sugar maples and kind of two little spots in the driftless area that stayed quite a bit wetter just because of their orientation in those particular valleys. But you'll notice that kind of the main thing from this is, other than those places, we see just a real sparse little other trees. So it was kind of dominated by a number of trees. We have a few things happening along the Mississippi River, like the white ash and the birch, but otherwise just kind of a little smattering of other things. And as we look at kind of historic, so if we go from pre-settlement to more current, so when this paper published in 2015 used kind of 2006 to 2010 is when they did their surveys, and found that we had this great decline in white oak. In particular, red oaks not changed too terribly much. More maple basswood, not surprising with the increase in precipitation that we've seen over that time. But probably one of the big things that you notice is how much other we have. So our forests have changed. We see more mesic forest, so that is more wet forest, and these kind of drier forest areas have been on the decline. And probably one of the big things is the removal of fire. We just don't have fire on the landscape like we did at one time. That would have been largely responsible for keeping those savanna habitats. And then kind of the last forest one to look at a little bit, but I just always found this interesting, going from pre-settlement at the top to the 2000s as current, and seeing this great change in other species in particular. So looking at the dominance of these different things, that pretty much everywhere has seen a lot more other and a lot less of the white oak, red oak, and the maple basswood. So kind of the point there is that we've seen pretty great changes. Of course, probably the most significant change are our conversion to agriculture in this area. Looking at this is Snowflake Ski Club. So we're at the headwaters of Timber Coulee. So if you look over here, that's about here on this. I just always find these old aerial images kind of interesting. One of the things I'll talk a little bit about that I think is really kind of important and has been happening lately. So here, 1940s photo, you'll see these contours are just kind of starting to get formed. We're just, kind of the watershed management movement then. But you'll notice in some of the more recent photos, some of those contours are gone. So planting larger fields without as many contours, and that has kind of changed things. And this I thought was just fun to talk a little bit about. So this is 1939 in Viroqua. It looked like a much different place. So 56 going out of town and 14 going to the north, and the old fair racetrack. So we see a lot more ag, right? So if you look across the state, that's kind of happened everywhere. We've seen some forestry recovery, especially kind of along the lower Wisconsin River, where so here in the 1990s is kind of where this runs up to. We see a lot more forestry in that lower Wisconsin River basin, but also here's the Kickapoo River watershed, and we see quite a bit of forest coming back there that had been converted to ag, but some of that ag didn't work real well. Same kind of story you see in parts of northern Wisconsin as well, where we tried farming some of these areas in northern Wisconsin that didn't work so terribly well, so they're reverting back to forest. So that idea of succession. We, of course, kind of won most famously, I think, Aldo Leopold had worked in the Kickapoo, or in the Coon Creek watershed in particular, and putting in these contour plots. So these are the same locations without the contour, and you kind of see the strips running up and down the hill versus now the contour strips to try to hold soil a lot better. The farming that we had done, that people had been used to doing, did not work real well in our steep slopes, so contours came in instead. And that was the Soil Conservation Service, which is today the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Giving a driftless talk, you of course feel like you have to share this image. Really just kind of shows the amount of erosion that had happened. So if you use the guy in the horse for scale, we are several horses deep in this really little creek. This is up around Maduro, as best I understand. And then kind of to talk about that in terms of data, this is a really cool figure from Trimble and Lund paper. And what they're really seeing is sort of in the 1900s. So we're seeing this great increase from 1900, 1910, 1920 up to 1930s and 40s, where we've got this massive amount of erosion taking place. So this is kind of the erosion that's taking place on the On the hills, the 1940s, it's gotten better because contour farming and everything, where we're decreasing the amount of valley sedimentation. So the dark line is how the valleys are filling in. That's really been kind of the story of the Driftless, is a lot of that soil that used to be on the hills is now in the valley. So our streams look nothing like they used to. Probably one of the most famous papers about this is a Trimble paper. And he's talking about all of this, so the amount of erosion off of the hillsides was really immense until about 38. We started doing some contour farming and we greatly reduced that, but we're still depositing pretty large amounts into the main valley. So that is, we're into the lower parts of the main valley. So down by Chaseburg on Coon Creek and down, along the Kickapoo River and places like that, we see some pretty great deposits that had happened during that time. Our tributary valleys as well, seeing quite a bit. We're lessening it in recent years. What I think is always kind of interesting about this is efflux is basically how much sediment makes its way to the Mississippi River. You'll notice that really hasn't changed over time. So much of that sediment just kind of made its way to the valleys and stayed there. And today we're moving about as much to the Mississippi as we ever have. And this just kind of to show that scale a little bit, how greatly, how much of this, if I can kind of point with my pointer as best I can, the original landscape would have been somewhere through kind of here. And all of that above that is soil that used to be on the hillsides that is now in the valley along the stream instead. So Jim Knox had done a ton of work on that. This was kind of his conceptual view of this. And essentially, if you look at this line right around, 11 feet, 12 feet or so, is where the valley used to be. So this was pre-settlement. And then all of this other stuff that he's showing on here is basically sediment. So we're talking about, 12-ish feet in places or more of, up to 20 feet in some places of sediment that has moved into the valleys. And this is the view of what this kind of looks like in a more, a cartoon version of it, so we can understand it a little bit. Our pre-settlement valleys had these wet prairies. Our floodplain would have been pretty great. We filled that valley with this pre-settlement alluvium, another fancy way of saying stuff off the hillsides, all this fine sediment. And now we have this drier area instead. We have a much different place. We have room for crops. We have box elders, which were not common before. And to restore this, which is really, really hard to do, we'll talk about one project where that really did happen. But to really talk about restoration, we need to get rid of that cultural sediment. And I think kind of the big take home from this is that our streams occur in really, really highly altered valleys. That is, our valleys are nothing like they used to be. So talking about restoring to what things used to be is kind of almost impossible unless you're willing to spend a ton of money to move all that sediment. Talking about moving sediment stream power, so that's a post I'd written about at one point in time, but it's really kind of a factor of stream slope. So the steeper the slope, the greater the power, the greater the discharge, the greater the volume of the water, the greater the stream power. And stream power is basically a measure of what particles can get moved from tiny little silt to those face rocks on lunker structures and stuff that we've seen moved in floods. And this is kind of showing that morphological evolution. So our pre-settlement streams, where they would have very easily, floods would have gotten onto the floodplain, to we're kind of getting back to that in more recent times, but in a much, much smaller valley instead. So in a much, or not valley, but in a much smaller channel. So it can reach the floodplain, but it's constrained by this cultural sediment that is there today. And again, one more of these kind of loss of floodplain connectivity is that what we've seen is that now in this entrenched stream, it takes a lot of water before we start getting onto the floodplain and dissipating energy, where in pre-settlement conditions, that would not have been the case. Here is a case from the east branch of the Pecatonica. And what was interesting about this is a place that actually did restoration. So they pulled the cultural sediment out of this valley and trucked it elsewhere, a very expensive project. But they were able to reestablish this wet meadow as it would have naturally been. And then, of course, the 2018 floods, as we talk about kind of what happened after the 2018 floods. Here is an example from Ruland's Coulee, which I'm sure some of you are probably familiar with. These Nick Point riffles kind of going through the grasses and everything. We've got these new waterfalls in the Driftless for a short period of time. We had issues with structure, so this stream got fixed really quickly because it was about to undertake a shed. We saw this all over the place, right? So we're talking about nearly $250 million in damage in that area, mostly in the Coon Creek and West Fork watersheds, but certainly other places as well. I was always surprised that nobody lost their life in that, especially because so much of this rainfall happened overnight and the dams broke pretty early in the morning and nobody was killed, which was pretty amazing. We see similar changes. This is Bohemian or Coon Creek, another one of those kind of new riffles that got formed. This has since been changed. This is where the channel used to be. There's a nice spring that comes out of here and keeps a little bit of water in here, but it's kind of reverted to a wetland now, kind of one of those oxbows instead. And this is a place a little bit farther downstream on here. And again, kind of this, so talking about our stream banks and how altered they are, that most of this sediment would have been up on these hillsides at one time instead. And you see this great big wide stream after this flood, after the dam had given way on Bohemian as well. Another kind of image of Ruland's that if you've been there since, you know, it looks different. And then on the West Fork, and again, kind of looking at the temperatures on the West Fork, have been a little even warmer than they kind of have historically because we don't have the effects of Jersey Valley with the bottom draw right now, and kind of what's happened after the floods. So I talk about kind of the last thing on this is talking about stream manipulation in a less than perfect world. And I say less than perfect because we're dealing with climate change. We're getting more large precipitation events. We have land use changes, right? We've converted from more savannas and more deep-rooted grasses, prairie grasses, to much more agriculture. And we see these valley changes as cultural sedimentation has happened. So I think it's really important that people understand that when we're doing stuff in the watersheds, we're doing it to streams that are highly, highly modified, right? They are not natural streams. They are not streams that we would have seen had you been here. Kind of always one of my dreams would be to be able to go back in time and see what the landscape looked like before everyone got here. Well, our streams certainly don't look like that. And to talk about that just a little bit, this was kind of a fun one where I wrote about this fairly recently. This idea that's basically our stream channel shapes are a function of our hydrology, so how water moves, the geology and the sediments that constrain it, and then the biology. And I think this is kind of the newest part of this, is thinking about how it is that the grasses and trees hold soils in and such. And this, you know, in particular around us, we have a lot more shallow rooted vegetation that's replaced the deeper rooting vegetation we would have once had. So that is our cool season grasses, and some of our row crops have replaced a lot of our warm season grasses that were much more deeper rooting at one time. And this just kind of talks then a little bit about, as we change discharge, we also have an effect then on sediment load. It's a function of our slope. And then D50 is essentially how big our particles are. So larger particles, obviously harder to move. And then we talk a little bit about riparian vegetation, and what kind of talks about is that, so the uplands tend to have the least control on streams. We move into more places where we have facultative wetland plants, and then where we get to these obligate wetland plants along the streams, we see a greater biological control. We've kind of changed the biological control by changing to so much agriculture. This is a place on Coon Creek you may be familiar with as well. This, you know, kind of, well, I'll show another photo of this in a second, or in a few slides, that so just downstream of here a little bit, and you'll look at how it dealt with the flood. But these prairies, and they get burned quite, you know, fairly regularly. They've done a really good job of holding in the soil and holding these banks. And I think one of the things to talk about with this is, as crop prices have changed, right? You may remember the kind of the corn and soybeans, how much they've boomed in the last number of years. We've seen this great decline in the conservation reserve program. So Wisconsin is one of the highest states in the country in terms of what percentage of land we have lost from CRP. And I think that certainly has a big effect, that we have a lot more row crops in the watersheds than we used to, and a lot less grasses and grass waterways that help hold things in. We, of course, in the Driftless have a history of habitat manipulations. I'll show you a cool little thing I got from Kirkles and to kind of show that, the first evidence of one in 1955. We've also had kind of an evolution practices that is decreasing in hard structures, so less lunker structures and stuff, and more of these soft structures, and also a greater interest in reconnecting to the floodplain. So this is an image that Kirk had sent me from one of the earliest report that he could find about habitat improvements. These were on Bohemian or Coon Creek. I thought this was kind of the most interesting thing. As a result of investigations conducted, it was concluded that stream improvements without significant flood control did not result greatly increased trout populations. It was concluded that lack of effective flood control measures had been an important factor in this regard. So that kind of led to some of our 1960s efforts and 70s efforts of increasing flood control in the headwaters of these watersheds. And this is looking at one of those reaches on Bohemian, kind of pre-improvements, how kind of trampled down the banks were and everything, and then later with improvements and increased grazing, how much better that this will hold soil than the original. Maybe some of you have been on lunker builds. It's kind of funny. This was with the Five Rivers clubs at the West Fork a couple of years ago. We built those lunkers. They went in this summer. We were kind of joking that they might be the last 4 lunkers ever built in the Driftless area. Probably won't really be true, but they're certainly getting used a lot less. And those big work days where I know at Southeast Wisconsin, we had 40 and 60 lunker build days, and certainly not doing much of that anymore. Things have changed, in part because some of these lunkers have not ended up in the best places. So what we've really kind of focused on is floodplain connectivity, another image of fishing with Chris. So transferring energy from the stream channel out to the floodplain to dissipate that energy. And this is in a pretty heavily grazed continuous pasture, but in other places, especially along some of the other creeks in that area, along Coon Creek in particular, where the fences have gotten tore out in the 2018 flood, we see a lot more prairie and a lot more deeper rooted grasses that are coming in. And these warm season grasses and these wetlands that were created are probably doing a good bit to dissipate flood energy. So kind of talking about this to finish up is talking about we're doing this in a less than perfect world. So we're going to try to reconnect floodplains. That is, try to move the flood energy out of the stream channel and onto the floodplains as quickly as we can. Riparian restoration. So I know the DNR here and Coulee region chapter has worked to plant more trees along some of the streams, typically up from the streams a little bit, so they're not catching the flood debris, but so they are providing shading. So we're getting more shading during those really, really hot days, those 90-degree days. A 90-degree day with sun on the stream versus without sun on the stream are quite a bit different. Infrastructure, if you've been around the Driftless, you know that's kind of one of the biggest things that has happened as we see this. We need infrastructure that's built for larger floods, and hopefully some of the infrastructure programs that are getting put in place now we can take advantage of. And this is a bridge on Spring Coulee, but you'll know a number of bridges. You've seen a number of bridges in these Driftless valleys that 2018 has pretty well undermined them. And in large part because we are building bridges that just cannot pass the floods that we're experiencing today. So they find a different weak point around them, which is often right next to the bridge. And then I think one of the things we also deal with, of course, is that we have this built landscape. We have houses and barns and sheds and things in the watershed. And we, of course, have to protect structures when possible, structures being bridges and roads, but also being those houses and things like that too. Although we're certainly, as you see in some of the places, we're moving some of the people out of the floodplains to reduce that risk as well. And of course, we have constraints. So that is access and money and time and expertise and all this. And then I think one of the big ones is this sediment that's in the valleys. If we can't move it up, if we can move it out of the valleys, we have to find places for it. But that's a huge financial thing in the trucking of it. So I think what we'll probably see is a lot more of working as best we can to slope those banks back and move some sediment, but certainly not get rid of all of that cultural sediment, because financially it just is mostly an impossibility. So what we have seen that's held up, so this is that Coon Creek site again. This is downstream pretty far on Coon Creek. We're just above Coon Valley. And you'll notice that all these prairie grasses just kind of laid down in that big flood, or in a big flood. So it did its job. That is essentially what floodplains are supposed to do. These softer structures, so root wads and things like that, and some of these boulders here and there, rather than lunkers, have held up really well. The position in the watershed has really mattered a lot too, is that we just are finding out that some of these upstream reaches are so steep, they have so much stream power during those high water events that they're doing damage no matter what you put in there, or almost no matter what you put in. So there are some places where we probably need to find ways to slow down water flow, and that's kind of our best hope. So again, kind of in these headwaters, these steepest places are where we've really seen some of the greatest damage. We've certainly seen some of it as we get down farther into the watersheds, but the streams that get really torn up tend to be pretty high in those watersheds. And then just kind of showing what it looks like. And I know, like, we always like to give a lot of crap for these golf course looking things. This is a continuously grazed pasture, so the cows are responsible for most of that. But this before, this big huge heat sink, versus this after, where we're moving the water along, and we're providing, rather than the steep bank, we're providing a nice sloped area where floods can access the floodplain. If we do get another 18, 20-inch rainfall like the one that caused this damage in the first place. So here's looking at Rulin's Coulee. Trying to drop my water bottle there, sorry. But just kind of how things have changed. We've narrowed it up since then, and we see a really nice little stream with the riffle flowing through it, rather than this at the West Fork Sports Club. You see this great erosion around this outside bend, and as we sloped that bend back much more, allowing access to the floodplain at the West Fork, and it's looking a lot better now than it did after that. And then this was kind of, I know that almost all of us here fish, but I think it's not just a fisheries issue, and it's not just that we care about the fishes, but reducing flood energy upstream is going to save money downstream. So this is, in Coon Valley, looking at what the water looked like and the damage that was done after 2018. You may remember that camper that was against those flags for about a month until it finally got moved. Pretty amazing amount of destruction that had happened through there. If we can do stuff upstream, we may be able to reduce some of those events. So we're not going to make things perfect, but we can make things better. I think one of the things we deal with a lot is we need better infrastructure. Bridges have been a major issue. We see a lot of damage associated with bridges. So not just to the bridges, but flooding from them, reducing downstream flooding to the larger cities along, or towns along the rivers. And then I think one of the things that and this was really brought home when we had the Crosse County conservation folks talk to our chapter the other week, talking about how many tons. I mean, it is thousands of tons of sediment and phosphorus in particular that gets delivered to the Mississippi River and gets delivered to the Gulf of Mexico. And today, almost all that phosphorus is coming from these stream banks. So if we can protect those stream banks, if we can pull those back, move that phosphorus out, we deliver less to the Gulf of Mexico and don't have the dead zone issues that we're currently seeing. And I just always loved this photo. This was from somewhere in the Kickapoo watershed. And I just think floods always do these really cool and interesting things. Where those steps came from, I don't quite know, but it was kind of interesting to come across those fishing one day. So that's kind of my presentation for the day. Just cover a lot of ground, I think.
Yeah, I'll say. Thanks, Jason. That was I guess so many ideas spinning in my head. I'm not sure where to start, but actually I do know where I wanted to start. I just want to clarify. You mentioned something real quick about the CRP, which I think stands for Conservation Reserve Program. Could you maybe just talk a minute about, we don't have to go into real intricate details, but maybe just give people, if they don't know what that means,
So
an idea of
conservation,
what it's for.
yeah. So Conservation Reserve Program was put in the 1980s, I believe. And the idea is that we're going to take highly erodible lands and plant them with grasses and to some degree trees, but particularly grasses that were going to hold sediments better and we weren't going to have the erosion issues. So it paid for grass waterways, it paid for a number of fallowed fields and stuff like this, which was also kind of happening at a time that crop prices were low. So it was paying farmers to take land out of production. And then once crop prices came back, so this particularly, what was that, about 10 years ago, that we really saw a pretty big increase in corn and soybean prices. We saw a lot of that land pulled out of Conservation Reserve Program and the Wetland Reserve Program.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty alarming when you see that, like 60% decline or whatever the number was for Wisconsin. I don't know. It was a lot of acres that are no longer.
We had the second highest. We had the second highest percentage of loss of any state in the country. There were certainly states that had a lot more total loss because they just had a lot more CRP.
Yeah, absolutely.
In particular.
You kind of touched on it on the end, and I just wanted to bring it up to let folks know that, just to make people aware, something that Wisconsin Trout Unlimited is working on at our state capitol. We've been working with the Wisconsin Wetlands Association and the Wisconsin Towns Association. It stemmed from a couple of legislators in the Driftless area who are concerned about flooding and the effect that it's having, and trying to figure out a way to get out in front of it. So right now, when you look at when a bridge blows out, and you showed plenty of pictures of that, there's lots of money, like there's lots of agencies and funds to help people rebuild that bridge. But what there's not a lot of help for is, like, before the bridge blows out, like going through and looking at our watersheds and saying, oh, this is a risk, we have some liability here with this piece of infrastructure. This one, if we get a gully washer, like, this bridge is going to blow out, and being prepared for it and trying to figure out ahead of time, and then taking a closer look at the watershed. And like you said, what we do upstream matters with what's coming downstream. So that's something that we're looking at doing, and I think it's going to be a pilot program to start. It's a flood resiliency grant program. It's going to be available to communities and nonprofit organizations if they want to do the work, but just to start going into some of these watersheds and evaluating what's there. And a lot of times what happens is that bridge is blown out, and or even a culvert might be that's blown out. And when the money comes to fix it, you can only replace it with what's there now. You can't, like, upgrade it or change, because that changes the hydrology. And if you want to change the hydrology, if you want to pass more water through that, you have to do some studies to show that that's not going to damage downstream properties, right? And so a lot of towns and communities they're not there yet. They don't have the foresight to be able to do that on the fly. And so the same size culvert gets put in, and then 2 years later you watch it get washed out again. So, which everybody knows is kind of, it's nonsense. We can't keep doing things that way. But so we're going to try to do some things to get out ahead of some of that stuff. But yeah, your presentation really touched on a lot of those issues. So glad to see that, and just wanted to let folks know that we're pretty active on some of those issues at the state level.
Just to talk about that a bit, I know our last chapter meeting, we had folks from the La Crosse County Conservation Office in. They had a $600,000 grant to essentially look at the watershed issues on Bostwick Creek, and really made some great headway. But also, it's really expensive to put in grass waterways and to do some of these things. And but there are places where we're really starting to get a foothold on it because of the issues that they've dealt with.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the other things that your presentation touched on, which I've come into, um, I've dealt with as an issue as well from a Trout Unlimited perspective. For folks who don't know, I'm a volunteer on our Trout Unlimited's Embrace a Stream committee, and we dole out, tens of thousands of dollars to local chapters for their projects all around the country every year. Um, and there's 10 of us volunteers that sit on that committee, and I will say it almost goes without saying that the person that sits in this upper Midwest, this Great Lakes region position, is Henry Colts before me. But we go into these meetings and we bring these projects from our area, and their chapters looking for funds to do the restoration projects. And everybody else around the country goes, "Whoa, you guys are like rocking the banks, like putting in solid rock riprap for like a mile of stream. Like this is crazy. That's not how you do stream restoration and that." And so we get like everybody throws up the red flags, and we have to dial it back and have that conversation with them and go back to like the horse picture, right? With like all the erosion that all this dirt and soil was on top of the hills, and it's now in the valleys, and we can't go back to, it's like you said, it's not a natural system anymore, and we need to just accept that and figure out a way to work with it. And what we found to this point, like rock works pretty well to stabilize those banks and prevent some of this erosion that's been happening over the years. So um, I just know you did a good job of touching on that, and I know that's something that I hear from other people around the country that kind of look at what we're doing here and be like, wait a sec, that's not, you shouldn't be doing that. And then it comes back to this conversation that, well, restoration is really local. Like you can't really say what's going to work in. I know you're from West. You did your study work at West Virginia, right? You went to school there. So you can't necessarily say what happens or how you do it in West Virginia and it worked perfectly is going to work perfectly in like northern Wisconsin, right? Because they're two different areas. So um, I guess I'll end with a question. Where do you think we're headed in terms of like stream restoration? What do you think we're going to see in the next 10, 20 years?
I think probably a lot more, hopefully a lot more watershed, looking at things from watershed level, looking at preventing water from getting to the stream so fast. So certainly the again, back to Bostwick Creek and what they're doing there, and looking at these grass waterways where they were having some pretty significant erosion issues in the fields and gullies starting to form. And I think that has been kind of a big thing. The issue has been that it's always has to be kind of agriculture farmer led and driven, that it's, we have a lot of private land, and people have to want to, you know there has to be money to help pay for them to put those things in, because they're really not cheap. I mean, we're talking about one of these projects was, I think, $120,000. So it certainly did a lot of help, but $120,000 is a pretty significant amount of issue to put into one large grass waterway to prevent erosion into the
Yeah,
stream.
absolutely. So let me ask you this. So if we're getting out of the business of building lunkers, and I'm thinking from a Trout Unlimited perspective, and I guess maybe I think this way because you and I both got involved in this organization 15, 20 years ago at about the same time. And we were both involved with the Southeast Wisconsin chapter, and that chapter started partnering with other chapters around the state, and we would have, like you said, massive lunker. We just go out and build lunkers. We build like 60 or 70 of these things and get a bunch of people together and work at it for a day or maybe come back 2 months later and you've got like 80 of these things that are ready to go on the stream. And if we're not doing that anymore, like do you see like what's the role for like TU volunteers and work days? Like how do we stay active and in doing these restoration projects or being involved? Because I think it really helps drive involvement, and you got to keep people involved and they got to feel like they have a stake in the game, if they're going to care about things.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, that's something that I know a lot of us have been talking a lot about over the years. Like how are we going to keep people active and interested and involved? And, there's prairie burns and some things like that. Certainly there's some, so I think some of it is maybe a little bit adjacent to the stream. I think there's still some stuff that is done in the stream, but so much more of it is kind of large contractor done. I know we've even talked brushing around here that, what is it, the Fecon head or whatever that's on the backhoe now, that they hardly need us to brush too, because they can do, they can do in, a day what it would take us several work days to get done. So, yeah, I think that's kind of a great question, is how to stay involved. And I think it's, maybe thinking kind of more watershed scale. And I think the other thing that we could really do a lot more of is on the monitoring side of things. So certainly with the WISE H2O and maybe some other things. I know one of the things I've been kind of looking to do is to, maybe look at when trout are spawning and where and stuff like that. And, maybe doing that next fall with students and maybe getting some TU volunteers. So finding ways to get them out, but it probably won't be the lunker builds anymore. We're going to have to find, other things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know I was just had some folks from the Southern Wisconsin chapter out. They've been working on a stream in Richland County all week, helping the DNR. It's the headwaters, which used to be predominantly brook trout, and now it's flipped and it's almost all brown trout that are in there. And so I know volunteers have been out there, working with the DNR. They're basically going through with backpack shockers and like pulling up all the brown trout, and the brook trout get left in the stream, and the brown trout all get put in a bucket, and they get brought back to they get put in a big holding tank, and they're getting pit tagged and clipping the adipose fins, but they're trucking them miles downstream, into the bigger watershed and relocating them in hopes that we can give the brook trout population there a chance to rebound. I guess I was talking to the fisheries biologist today, and he was saying how the genetics of the brook trout there are really good. They're like a pure native strain, or like high priority genetics in this stream. So it's really important work that we do that. And I think that's kind of one of the things too that we're going to have to look at more opportunities like that as volunteers, to say that this is a place where we just got to find ways where we can help make things better. So there's certainly not a silver bullet or like a one size fits all, but there's always buckthorn to cut, right?
Yes, yeah. And if not, I'm sure somebody will bring in another invasive that we'll deal with.
That's right.
Tree of Heaven, whatever is the next one.
Yeah, somebody mentioned reed canary grass earlier, and like I know, talk to folks in the wetlands who work in the wetlands field too, and that's a constant. How do we do, or like Phragmites now is kind of the new thing. Like once this stuff starts, like there's nothing that slows it down, and it just kind of takes over the wetlands. And like how do we get a handle on some of this stuff? So yeah, lots to do, but it's not busy work. It's kind of got to be thinking about it. We got to be thinking, like you said, on a watershed scale. And I know I saw Bob Jazwowski was on here. I don't know if Bob's still on, but I know he coordinates the Central Wisconsin TU chapter. I'll give them a plug. They do an awesome program. They call it River Keepers, and it's folks who are they go out and they monitor the local streams like once a month, and they're hooked up with the DNR, and UW Extension has their Water Action Volunteer Network, and they just plug the data into the system, and they've been doing that for years. And they get great crews out there, and I think there's, as a Trout Unlimited as an organization, we got to look to doing more of that stuff, and just being, like you said, being good stewards of our resources and our waters. So, somebody mentioned wild parsnip. I just saw that. Yeah, if we could eradicate that, that's not an easy volunteer job either.
That has been a scourge.
Yeah. We got a few. I've had some burns on my hand that lasted about 2 years. The last time I got into that stuff really good. It's pretty nasty. So, I guess we got a couple of minutes left. Is there anything you want to close on? You want to leave us with some? You want to can I get you to talk? I know you don't like to do self promotion, but can I get you to talk for maybe a minute or two about the blog and just kind of like for folks who might not be familiar with it, like what types of posts or what types of things you're talking about on there, and just
Sure.
give us a little flavor of what you're doing over there.
So yeah, so like Mike said, the blog was kind of a COVID thing. If y'all remember, what was that, spring of 20? Boy, what a time that was. So I've been writing for that's about 3 years or so. And scientific kind of ideas sometimes. So kind of the gamut of everything. Some of them are more fishing posts. Certainly fly tying tends to be a little bit more in the winter. I will admit I've not tied as much lately, but I will again this winter. So a little bit of that, a little bit of science, a little bit of kind of fishing. It just kind of depends on what my mood is. And I've got like 100 posts ready to finish, but so I've got plenty of ideas. It's just having the time to get to them and get through them. I think priorities, have changed a bit with grad student and trying to learn how to program in R a little bit more and stuff like that. So my evenings have been on the computer trying to do computer programming and stuff like that, so I can learn I'm basically learning a new language right now. So, but I'll certainly have something for 2 weeks from now. What it is, I don't quite know yet.
Cool.
Yeah, they're fun.
Somebody asked if you're I think they meant FFF, Federation of Fly Fishers. Is it still FFF? Do you remember?
Yeah, I can't. It's International Fly Fishers now or something like that. I have not been lately. I used to when I was in Madison area because the Badger Fly Fishers were a good and active club, so I was pretty active then. But I have enough with the West Fork and the Coulee region chapter and the stuff I do for Trout Unlimited right now. I put in a lot of volunteer hours in a year. So
yeah, I hear you.
Oh, the old internet group. Yes, yeah. Yeah. I have not.
Message board. Is that what he's talking about?
I was a member a long, long time ago. Yep. I think that one's kind of died away, but yeah.
Gotcha. Yes, that's right. Yep. Back in the days of message boards.
Yeah, I got to know Hans Weilandman very well. So he was a good friend. He met he met here at the West Fork. We took him fishing. That was the week before I went to graduate school out in West Virginia.
Wow. That was awesome.
1997.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool. All right, Jason, I think we're going to let you get back to, I understand you got to grade some papers this week, maybe, or a few tests to grade.
Never a test tomorrow. I got 17 papers in today. I get another 17 tomorrow. Yeah, it's going to be a busy one.
Yeah, I know you're busy and really appreciate you taking the time tonight, and really interesting presentation. I hope folks get a chance. If you miss something, we'll put it up on our YouTube channel. Feel free to go back and slow down. I know you had quite a bit on those slides. There's a lot of information there to kind of digest and go through. So hope folks get a chance to go back and relook at some of this stuff. And the topics are relevant. This is going to be the stuff that we're talking about for the next 10, 15, 20 years, I imagine. So it's not going anywhere. But
no, it is not.
Yeah. So really appreciate that. I see we got a lot of good thanks coming through on the chat. So really appreciate everybody coming out and tuning in tonight. Apologies for our extended summer break. That was really my fault. I didn't have my stuff together this fall, and so I apologize for that. But we're gonna get back on the horse, and we're gonna start doing these every first Wednesday of the month. So hopefully we'll see you in December. All right. Take care, everybody. Thanks again, Jason. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.